Welcome to Within WordPress, the podcast that features all those people inside the WordPress community. Some are seen, some are not, less seen. With us today is Christos, and possibly a little less seen, but I most certainly have seen you quite a few times. Welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Ramkus, and hi, everyone else. My name is Christos. I work at Presidium as a performance engineer, and I've been in the WordPress scene seriously, I guess, for just about 3 years, aside from, small projects that I've had throughout my 12-year career in IT.
What does serious mean? Because that means there's an unserious phase before that?
Yeah, so WordPress was always my go-to thing for when I wanted to make a site for a friend, or maybe, those kind of jobs you pick up when you're still trying to find where you fit in the IT realm. And you're like, yeah, I can do that, and I can do that too. You become a yes man of sorts.
Yeah.
You don't end up doing a project very well at the end of the day. You just kind of do it for someone. WordPress was my go-to because it was kind of a default thing from school.
That's an interesting approach, but yeah, from school, I don't hear that much.
Yeah, I was born and raised in the States, Burbank, Illinois, outside of Chicago.
Yeah.
So we had Electronics 1, Electronics 2, and then a computer-oriented class, and then a network-oriented class. They were elective classes in high school. Yeah. And the only thing they taught us was WordPress. I can't recall the version, but it's not that we really learned WordPress, not like the things that the community or the learning group. Yeah. So I just knew what the word WordPress was in my head. And I would say, okay, cool, let's make a site. What do I use? WordPress.
That's pretty much how I think everybody that I know started to learn WordPress at one point or another. Yeah, I mean, pretty similar for me. I needed a website, had one, created it on Joomla, and then figured, this is not my platform. How do I migrate it away to something that's a little less convoluted? And just played around.
That's pretty common. I hear a lot about people going from Joomla to WordPress.
Oh, that was I would say in the early 2000s, that was the thing to do because you couldn't explain it to end clients. They'd be like, yeah, I just heard your explanation, but I just still don't get it. Where do I do this? Where do I add that? It just became just too complex, I guess. But how did you make the switch into sort of playing with it and then becoming a little bit more serious into it?
It has 100% to do with starting at Presidium, that does manage WordPress hosting. So it ended up being full WordPress. If I got a different job, I probably wouldn't have been so engaged with WordPress, as I am for the past 3 years.
So explain a little bit more the kind of stuff that you do, because I know you have a high focus on performance, and I think we are very much similar in that. But explain a bit more. What is the thing you do?
Cool. Initially, we started with load testing, specifically for WordPress websites that would eventually turn into capacity planning, which is kind of one of the same. We're using load testing to do capacity planning. So saying I have an eShop and I'm expecting X amount of concurrent users on my site. Using technologies like JMeter in the beginning. I'm transitioning, or trying to at least transition, to K6 because JMeter is old. It's good. It's there. It's good. It's steady. But it kind of holds you back to what you could do.
I know what it is, but most people probably don't know what K6 is. Can you explain a little bit what that is?
Yeah, it's programming oriented. Yeah, you could write your routines. So test routines are just like scripts that's try simulating real users actually visiting the website. Moving around, clicking things, pushing buttons. This is all protocol-based testing, so it doesn't really have to do with the user's actual experience of a page loading. Core Web Vitals covers things like what it looks like while it's loading, and performance is a bit different. And I'm not going to say skewed, but on the back end, or the protocol-oriented stuff.
I'll say it's skewed because there's no RUM in there.
Okay, so this is controversial already. We just started. I will agree that the metrics for the front end stuff, they're based off theories that people just, thought have to do with how performance is observed
And
from an end user. But the protocol-based stuff is definitely technical. Like it's just requests and timings, requests and timings.
I think also Kevin Ohashi uses it for review signal, like the benchmark testing for all these different types of WordPress hosting that he does yearly. I think he also uses K6.
I don't remember. Very probably like K6 Cloud. So the K6 Cloud is a different solution. It's all hosted for you. You don't have to sit and write the scripts. And there's a UI and everything. It is paid rather than so K6 is open source by itself, but K6 Cloud is the paid version.
I don't know which version he uses, but yeah, K6 is. I mean, it's a good tool. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't trying to be argumentative there, but I think the great thing about testing is understanding that what you're testing is usually a lab test and not a real user experience test, which is very difficult to pinpoint. Where does one thing start and where does the next? Where is that?
Everyone has like performance is the distribution of like metrics. You have to look into everything so you can kind of figure out what you're doing. But on the scope of like capacity planning, that's easy. That's easy. It's not easy. It's simple. So there's a misconception about the words easy and simple. Simple things aren't necessarily easy, right? So like writing assembly, super simple, not easy. With capacity planning, you just have to, you literally make the request. So anything protocol based is good. Using something like JMeter or K6 will be suffice to know where your site has, maybe to identify a bottleneck or maybe to test your hosting provider to see if they can handle the traffic or your caching solution or whatever you have going.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit more about the protocols? Like what would be typical protocols you would employ in your testing?
Protocols like HTTP2?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are more than
like the whole process. Cool. So this is the fun part. This is where it all starts off with communication. I mean, IT should be based around communication. So it's a communication with the client to see what's going on their website. Like you were telling me you have an eShop and you expect users, like a huge flood of users on Black Friday, which was just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
What do your users do would be like my first question. Could we kind of map out? Do you have some heat maps? Do you have something ready? Do they even go to your homepage? Because most people optimize homepages, but most people don't get directed to a homepage. There's usually a pricing page or they go to a login page. I want to get that information from the client. If we can have good communication, if I can really gauge like what real users do on the website, then the test routine, that's like the kind of script that is played over and over by the testing engine, let's say JMeter, the results will be more conclusive. They're never going to be 100%, but the first step is definitely identifying what your real users do on your website.
Yeah.
If we can get that, go ahead.
And I was going to say, I think most people just highly underestimate this particular point. What are users actually doing? I love that you highlight that the vast majority of certainly campaigns are not going to hit your front page. They're going to hit your product page. They're going to hit your pricing page. They're going to hit your hell, even the login and all that sort of stuff. And all of those are well, if they're coming through a tracking URL, by pure definition, it's already uncached. So you're testing bare metal. But for those that just manage to solve that part, as soon as you then see an article or a product that you like and you hit it to cart, the rest of your session is uncached. How do you solve that? Because that's immediately a performance hit. Those types of things, and I love that you mentioned them already. Those types of things are general. Where do I start fixing performance on the caching layer specifically? But there's so much that just comes from that principle of understanding how traffic actually moves on your site, in what capacity, in what frequency, all that sort of stuff. Love it.
Well, okay, I could see where you could overlook it, but to fix something, you have to know what's wrong, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the first part is definitely exploratory. Um, what would the next step be? Then it gets easy once you get through the whole human communication part, because that's the most difficult part in IT. Actually, talking to computers. That's why ChatGPT and all these models, they're gonna have a hard time understanding humans.
Yeah.
Once that's out of the way, actually generating a script and putting some pseudo random behavior in the script, trying to ramp up concurrent users and then get back all the results, like the response times. They're all response times at the end of the day. It could be network latency. It could be the whole request. It could be time to first byte, which is like the very first response you get back for making a request, clicking on something or typing something in and pushing enter. That part's the easy part. So let's say we figured out what's going on. We made the test routine and then we run it. But it's not that simple during the run it part because lots of things happen in between. I've never ran a single test plan once. It's not a thing. The test plans I generally work with are around maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes long. Anything longer would be an endurance kind of test.
Yeah.
So in the realm of testing, there's lots of words that people throw around, like endurance testing or spike testing,
Stress testing,
soak testing. It's all kind of the same. The only thing that really changes is how you apply the simulated users. Do they come in a burst? Do they come in multiple bursts? Is it just like a ramp up? And that has to do with what you want to figure out. So in capacity planning, I prefer doing soak testing, concurrency soak testing, which means we just ramp up at a steady rate, maybe with like steps of like, let's throw 5 users at it. Maybe with a direct line going up. I do prefer the steps though, because then you can see how the systems respond over, let's say you add 5 users and then you wait 2 minutes. During that 2 minutes, you might see the first like couple of seconds after adding maybe 5 users or maybe 10, if it's an intensive test, you'll see a spike in the response time. Then it's up to your, I don't know, hosting solution, hosting provider, caching engine, all that like backend heavy stuff to do something with that traffic. Like the initial spike is fine, but if it stays up there, or if it keeps going up after adding some users, then you've got a problem.
Yeah.
If you have an initial spike and then it balances out, you're all good. So we do that over and over and over and over by adding users and gauging the results. At some point, you're going to see an ever raising response time. That's usually
that one is inevitable. At some point, it's going to be there. Hopefully,
when you reach
very
that,
far away.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it depends on every situation too. But when you see that, that's when you know that, okay, cool, that's your max. Doing that and repeating that over and over, you can come to some sort of conclusion. It's never 100%, but you can come to some sort of conclusion that, hey, buddy, we just did load testing or stress testing, call it whatever you want. And that's your max. With your current hosting solution, with your current website, with your current code base.
And then where do you start from there? I like that. Yeah, that is the fun part. You mentioned the little spike going up, and then it should stabilize. I have a fun example in that where. In a sort of stress test, I came into a situation where the exact same thing happened, kept adding users, and then at a certain point where you would expect for stuff to stabilize because the load wasn't that high yet, we saw a huge increase in resource happening on the server. And like, what's going on here? Because there's nothing that aggressive happening. Turns out that the way that particular site was configured, there was a caching plugin that upon request generated everything it thought it needed to cache and turn into a static HTML version of it. And just the sheer amount of pages on that site meant that caching plugin did that over and over and over, compounding on compound, and just wild, like just basically DDoSing itself to the point of like, how did somebody come? Okay, anyway, let's fix this. But you're mentioning the little spike and then it should calm down. Reminded me of that one. That was a fun one to discover. Okay, it's not that complicated to fix this one.
Yeah, what did you do? You added preloading to the caching stuff?
First, I removed the caching solution altogether and then just wanted to see what bare metal did. And then from there, we started implementing whatever we needed to cache because the way that cache worked was just not making any sense in the grand scheme of the whole server. And ultimately, I went for an entirely different internal caching. So lots of transients were added to cache certain queries and stuff. That was the heavy part in terms of what the database needed to produce. And the rest was just using a smarter caching engine.
Yeah, caching's complicated.
There's so many layers.
Yeah. And the caching is like, I don't remember where I read this. It's not my own words, but caching is an amazing way to cover up a bottleneck and, not be able to identify it.
One of the things I frequently say on social media, just to remind people that caching doesn't solve your performance issue. It hides it. And if you're doing it correctly, then you may get away with it. Like you'll never see the downside of it. But the vast majority of sites that need performance and that just solely rely on, whether you're using WP Rocket, NitroPack, Varnish, Cloudflare, APO, any of those solutions, they're great in what they do and all have their pros and cons and all that whatnot. But the moment you are assuming that every single 100 hits are all going to see your site cached, it's an illusion. It doesn't happen. And you can't build a strategy on that. So caching does not solve performance, period.
It can't be at 100%. With really configurable, like system level caching, you could probably go up to 90+%. Even with that example that you gave before, so that like what you said before for your campaigns, they have like a different link for a personalized link for every person that clicks on it. You can use Varnish, which is definitely a personal favorite, to create. They have something called VCL, so it's like a programming language for the cache on Varnish, and you can use it to like remember a certain pattern of query parameters. Which this is like hardcore caching.
For those listening and then just go like, what are these two rambling about? There's if you click a link, let's say you're sending an email from MailChimp, and you check that link as it appears in the browser address bar, you see there's a whole bunch of UTM tracking things or MailChimp specific, like a whole bunch of strings following the actual URL that you were using. And it is the stuff that is following the URL that is essentially deal breaker for cache. So it starts with a question mark.
Right.
Anything else is essentially meaning, hey, your site is no longer cached. And what Christos and I are referring to is that there is a way to sort of cache that, but certainly not out of the box. And you need to, do at whatever level, but you need to do certain things for certain patterns to be recognized as, this isn't always uncached. We should actually cache this once the first one has hit. I'm assuming Varnish, it's been a long time that I played with Varnish. It's not one of my favorites. Is it, I assume it's still warming up the cache that needs to happen, that one hit, right? So the first one who clicks it just has a bad experience and pretty much anybody else is then seeing a fully cached version of such a...
That's one way. It doesn't necessarily have to wait for the first hit. You can tell it to preload stuff.
Yeah, okay.
Right. And then it kind of has to do with like which cache. So you mentioned the layers. Varnish itself, you could split up into multiple layers. Varnish, for anyone that doesn't know what it is, it's basically a web server, and it sits on the server itself, and it should be as close to the network edge as far as your systems go. Not like Cloudflare stuff, not like hosting a full HTML or a full site on the cloud's edge. After that, inside your provider, if you have like, I don't know, multiple servers or some sort of n-tier architecture, which means that you have like a modular approach with multiple machines doing different jobs, it would be closest to the network edge of your provider, and your provider at a high level too. Not necessarily Presidium, but some Presidium upstream provider, or this is or any, right. It has to do with the actual server itself. But anyway, I kind of got lost there. Where was I?
So where Varnish is located, yeah.
Right. You can host Varnish in memory. That's an option. You can host Varnish on disk. You could do a combination of both. So then you have your hot cache in memory, and memory is hyper fast. It's not going to get faster than memory, not at a systems level. And then you can have your warm, not hot, on an SSD on that particular server that's closest to the network edge of your provider. That's a mouthful.
Yeah. And just to try to recap that, so what it essentially allows you to do, Varnish, is cache as local to your actual web server as possible before it hits what we call the edge. And edge caching, as the most common example, is Cloudflare edge caching. I think possibly they even invented it, the term. But Cloudflare would sit fully in front. Varnish would be in front of the actual web server itself, but then extremely close proximity of the actual web server on which your WordPress installation is installed.
Yeah. So if you did do the Cloudflare kind of edge caching, then yeah, it would go Cloudflare, Varnish, and then Nginx or Apache, whatever you use as a web server.
Yeah. Do you see scenarios where it makes sense to have both Varnish and Cloudflare?
Yeah, actually. Oh, okay. So this is trivial because Cloudflare itself is like super configurable.
Yeah, quite.
And things do change very often with Cloudflare. But I'm going to say yes either way. So if you have your Cloudflare set up as a basic configuration, you didn't do anything other than just put your domain in Cloudflare and enable caching, you could rely on Varnish to do the heavy lifting before things get to your web server, and then Cloudflare itself can update itself from what's served from Varnish.
But it wouldn't actually serve the full static HTML, right? So that stays in Varnish.
You could configure Cloudflare to do that, if I remember correctly. You could replace. Okay, so I guess you could replace Varnish with Cloudflare. So I'm a systems kind of guy, though. I don't know if I would do that personally, because I would want to log into the shell and see what the VCL does, and maybe configure it differently. So flexibility, I don't want to say you lose on flexibility, because Cloudflare itself is very flexible.
I think that the reason I'm asking you, because this is an interesting discussion, because at a certain point for certain scenarios, it becomes advantageous to think of Varnish as the solution. I've seen situations where I go, it makes total sense to use Varnish here. But I've also seen the other one where it just totally makes sense to rely on the Cloudflare layer, for instance. So because it is in front, acting on as close to the DNS level as it possibly can, but also with, I don't know how many data centers they have globally now. It's an easy way to reduce latency for requests that can be fully HTML.
Especially if you have some sort of business. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I live in the Netherlands, and obviously if I present my site hosted from the Netherlands, there is going to be latency for anybody from Australia, New Zealand, Japan to look at my site. That's just physics. And in those scenarios, Cloudflare makes sense. And then you lose something there in configurability, because obviously with Varnish, you have a better control.
I'm smiling because I was just going to touch on that. I was just going to say that if your user base is located in, for your example, the Netherlands, And that if you have like a site that's some sort of public service, for example, and everyone that's going to be accessing your site is probably everyone anyway. Most people accessing your site are going to be from the Netherlands. Then I wouldn't use Cloudflare. I wouldn't, because it's an expense too, right? At some point you have a client, right? Your client's not going to want the most expensive option that's going to be available around the world when they don't need it to be.
It makes no sense to invest in that direction if you get 100 visitors a month from outside of your country. I have clients like that where there's just no visit because it's in Dutch, or even more specific in Frisian, for instance. There's 500,000 of us, and we all live around where I live now. So we're not even going to get. We're going to get maybe a dozen hits on a monthly basis outside of this region. Yeah. It just doesn't make sense.
And at that point, it's your job to bring up that solution. You have to be like, oh wait, you don't need Cloudflare. You could use this.
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone does that. Most people have a stack, like a ready-made stack. Like, this is what I work with. I work with Cloudflare. I work with X provider or my own bare metal and my own Apache server. Lots of self-hosting going on with Cloudflare in front. Okay, so why do I say that? Before Presidium, I did lots of work on Upwork. And I would find clients for maybe WordPress-oriented optimizations. And the sites I would find were all a single server setup, maybe with a cPanel, usually with the cPanel, which I personally am this guy. I hate cPanel. Not just cPanel. I hate Plesk. I hate cPanel. I really don't think you need them.
Direct admin.
Then I would Cloudflare set up in front of that. So it was always like a single server setup, Cloudflare, and that's it. You don't need that.
Yeah, I think that's smart. That's a smart approach. So getting back to you, because we've derailed entirely my original question to you.
Did we?
Well, yes and no, but you do the test scenarios. You come up with a solution of what that specific configurable setting should be for that particular client in that particular scenario. What are your next steps from there? How do you proceed?
Well, as far as capacity planning, we're done. If you just want to migrate your site onto X provider, if you want to go into optimization, we're going to pick that point where in the little graph response times keep going up, and it would be great if, aside from the graphs with the response time, the client-side data, like the stuff that someone would probably see from their end, it would be great if you had access to the server-side stuff, resource usage, CPU usage, RAM, database stuff. If you can have like a detailed, if your provider has access maybe, or maybe you directly, if you're self-hosting, to very detailed like database monitoring, like the Procona setup.
Yeah.
Then you can get busy, like with the nitty-gritty stuff. Every situation is completely different. I would definitely look into caching first because, like you said, it's where most of the problems lay, at some caching layer.
Yeah. Do you include things like Redis?
Yes. Well, there's Memcached and there's Redis. Memcached is kind of a little bit older of a solution. It's not necessarily. Anyway, I'm more Redis oriented, yes, when it comes to object caching. So object caching. We mentioned layers before.
Yeah, I'm mumbling. What I was going to say, I did a podcast with Til Cruz, which I think is the third one I recorded, where Til and I talked about Object Cache and Object Cache Pro specifically, and its connection to Redis and how it optimizes databases and whatnot. So anybody listening curious about very, very deep into Redis conversation, check out that episode. And the reason I'm asking you is because Redis is for a very large crowd, a very mysterious layer that's doing something with the database. How would you best describe what it does?
I would try to explain what the layers like in caching for hosting a website are. Like we mentioned, the edge side caching, that's closer to the person trying to access the website, Cloudflare, maybe.
Yeah.
Then there's the caching engine that could be running on your provider, which might be Varnish, it might be Apache CGI or CGI integrated with Nginx. Works too. And then there's the requests that aren't cached. You know, the ones that we mentioned before. They might have a weird query string, some question mark, and some strings after that. That has to go to your web server. When something goes to your web server, that means that Apache has to accept that request. Apache has to trigger PHP. PHP runs. I don't have to explain what PHP is. Oh, okay. Everyone uses PHP, I guess. Most sites. So. When PHP runs, PHP might need to talk to the database. There is a bit of caching that could happen at the PHP layer too, like OP cache, PHP stuff, but I'm not going to get into that because that's really weird and complicated. Definitely per case too.
Yeah.
After that, so there's that part that we mentioned now with PHP talking to the database. That's after Apache or Nginx, whatever you use as a web server. Mm-hmm. There's a caching layer that could fit in there too, called the object cache. So there's like a bit of software that talks to another database of sorts called Redis, or maybe memcached. Redis. What is Redis? Redis is a super simple, remember simple doesn't mean easy, a super simple database, and it's a time series database. I could say it like that, right? So it's got it could be used as a time series database. It's not necessarily. All its records are, think of an Excel sheet with just 2 columns. Right? So you have like a key on one side, and on the other side, you have a value, key value pairs. That's one of the secrets behind why Redis or other databases that function that way are extremely fast. Like everyone knows, most people, especially people that are in IT and do this kind of work, realize that Redis is capable of handling millions of requests per second.
Yeah, it's
very like. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say it's wild what it can do once it's pushed.
So this caching layer, this object cache software thing that integrates with this weird database with just 2 columns, it can act as a middleman between requests that are made to the database, like requests that are made often to the database, or similar requests that are made to the database. And instead of making PHP talk to MySQL or MariaDB, which in nature it's an RDS relational database, it's going to relational databases. What does that mean? That you have one Excel sheet that's connected to another Excel sheet that's connected to another Excel sheet that's connected to another Excel sheet. Naturally, that's going to take resources. So like CPU, right? Maybe RAM too, but CPU. Now, with this middleman here, if you've set it up correctly, and if your site, very important, if your site supports it well enough, you can take those requests, store them in Redis, and then instead of having PHP talk to the database every time it has a request, especially if it's a similar request, again, over and over, it can just talk to Redis. So that segue is going to be a lot faster.
Bypassing the whole bunch of resources it would normally need to spend.
I like that word. That's a great word. So bypassing. Caching is bypassing. Caching is accessing something saved somewhere, bypassing something else.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of the and I'm typing this in now to see if I get a good hit. But there's the origin of caching, which is not necessarily to cache. It was meant to be, let me see what they say here, reducing the time it took to basically improve the system performance from a very different perspective. So they were just looking to solve certain things they saw happening. They weren't looking at, we want to make this faster. They were thinking, how can we make it smarter? Like, how do we bypass certain things we keep doing over and over again? So it was more of a, let's not repeat ourselves where we don't have to. And the concept of caching as we see it now is an entirely different beast. I kind of like how we just randomly got into something that was solving a particular issue, and then now it's a whole concept on all these layers that you just wonderfully explained.
I'm really happy I just grabbed that light that just fell and it didn't hit the ground.
I saw that. In this case, if you're listening to us on audio, you should want to check out anywhere around minute 33, 34. Because the video is interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, exactly what you said. So caching was probably, I don't really know the history of caching, not going to lie, but it was probably generated to solve issues like everything else in IT is. But by solving issues and making more things that solve issues, you generate new problems.
Yeah.
Like we didn't talk about invalidation at all.
Yeah.
What happens when you have everyone out there that has a WordPress website probably has a post somewhere. What happens when you update a post? So if you have your stored version at some layer of the cache and you've updated your post, you've probably maybe had a visitor, customer, maybe a coworker saying, the update wasn't made. I can't see the update.
I don't see it. My browser doesn't show it.
Maybe it's silly, like you misspelled the word before and it's before. It's still spelled wrong. Okay. In cache invalidation is when you say we have to delete that cache version, that stored version of your website, that actual HTML at whatever layer it's cached, if not all layers, ideally all layers. So that way the new version can be stored. At that point, unless you have some sort of automatic mechanism that both deletes it from the cache and puts the new version on the cache, the request has to go to the backend at least once.
Yeah,
at least once. It could be multiple times too, but at least once. What happens if you did do cache invalidation? So plugins do this by default, where they have a hook in WordPress that say delete the cache, or WordPress. A hook is used, telling the WP Rocket, for example, that you mentioned before, for their cache, which is on the actual file system, to delete that single page, right? And then you have your user hitting refresh. They're like, no, it still hasn't changed.
What's going on?
We forgot one of the layers. That's out of your control.
Yeah, well, the most important one, and the one you will hear the most clients complain about.
Do you want to introduce it?
Browser cache.
Yeah.
I literally had a conversation like this morning. I don't see the change. So, well, if you hard refresh, you will.
What hard refresh? Shift F5.
Yeah. So if you open up your browser and hit the inspect, then you get the option to hit the refresh button again with the right click, and then it has a hard refresh option. It's hidden. But what it essentially says to the browser, now that I add this special request to this URL, I want you to bypass your own browser caching. So whatever's happening in it. And for the record, I think this is mostly happening on Chromium-based browsers because they seem to browser cache longer and more persistent. But it basically says, bypass that, go back to the server, see if there's an updated version. And only then will you then see the change that you did on the server. Hopefully.
Yeah. That, or you like a private browsing session.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's easier, but then you have to explain to the client, why does it work in the private purple Firefox browsing session and not in the regular one?
This is hilarious. I literally had this conversation this morning with a client where he went like, we've changed this. What is going on? And I tested it on my mobile as well. I said, your mobile phone also has caching. And not only that, it actually is worse because your mobile provider has caching as well. Most people don't know that, but it's right there. Anything they can do to speed up. So certainly style sheets and stuff like that, they will cache.
That's messy.
It's horrible. It's horrible.
Okay, then what do we do there to, I don't know, maybe address that issue? There's always this thing called the TTL. How long something is kept in the cache until the request is allowed to go to the next layer, the backend.
Yeah. What do you?
That's tricky. Don't ask me if I have a default TTL. I will not answer. There's no such thing.
No, there isn't. But you can still have a preference though. But no. In some cases, it's 4 hours. It's too long already.
Yeah. So what's long and what's short for TTL? It's so trivial.
Yeah. Can you give an example where it makes sense to have a long TTL?
Okay, when you are, what could be a static site, it could just be, like a simple 5-page site that people set up. You want that to be hyper fast, and it's not going to change. I guess it's not necessarily a static site if it's using WordPress, because everything's dynamically generated by the backend. But by static site, I mean, in essence, nothing changes. There's no login. There's no customization. It's not going to say, oh, I see that you're visiting from Greece. It's going to just show you a website.
It's the context, right, of the site. Like if it's an e-commerce site or a highly visited site or a highly commented site, all of these things, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to cache into to infinity. I think, what is the longest? A year, I think, right? You can set the caching to a year. I think so.
I'm not.
Potentially, you could.
I'm curious though.
Do it longer. That'd be weird though. Yeah, I cached this somewhere 2 years ago.
Could you imagine like the site being cached on a browser for 2 years, but the site not being up anymore? And people accessing it?
I can. If set correctly, that sort of stuff happens, or set incorrectly, however you want to look at the predicament you find yourself in. But I've been doing performance optimization in various different layers and levels and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the examples that I've come across where people unknowingly checked on a few settings where browser cache in total became 1 year. How do you fix that? Because everybody has watched your site is in their browser cache. So what are you going to do? Ask all your visitors to refresh? That's undoable. So how do you solve that one? I mean, that's a headache. But you'll find those because people do these things. A year sounds good. Let me just turn that on. Here we go.
Well, most plugin providers, they have like a warning, like don't. I know Perf Matters has their like advanced settings that literally says don't mess with this unless you know what you're doing.
Yep.
Don't remember the wording, but it's something like that.
But you and I both know people will do this.
Yeah, curiosity's out there. It's a good way to learn things, by screwing up.
Oh. Yeah, I suppose that's a way to figure to figure out how to deal with it. But how do you solve problems like that? I mean, do you run into these types of issues as well? I mean, this is a layer of cache that is
something that's serious. No, it hasn't, something that serious has never like crossed my radar.
Good.
Serious, something that's dumb, something that's silly. I don't know. So I don't do like caching plugins either. I don't want to sound mean or like. I do support certain caching plugins, like WP Rocket is great. Perf Matters, love it, highly configurable. WP Rocket is super easy to use for the vast majority of people. I think I'm going to just stick to those two for like personal preference. I don't like it though, because it kind of has a single point of failure. You're going to be limited by the speed of the disk from your provider. It's always going to be limited by that, because all the files are the cache, the actual cache, which in this case is not in some sort of database like Redis, not on Varnish. It's literally a file or a series of files that are on the disk. So you're going to be limited by the disk. And what if it's not? What if it's what if it's not just one single SSD disk? And what if it's some sort of
stuff that replicates from left to right?
Network stuff, right?
Yeah,
what if it's some shared file system? Which is good, which is great. Yeah, you need it for replication, and it shouldn't be applied to everything, I guess. Maybe not database stuff in every situation.
So how do you solve that?
By not having to use plugins.
Yeah.
By using the system level. By using Varnish, for example, or by using Apache CGI. or Nginx.
I like
Whatever
Nginx.
flavor everyone likes.
Caching happening you can do there.
Most people do. I kind of have a bias here. Like when my first job, like based in IT in Greece, we used Apache for everything. So I don't know. Like I do accept that Nginx is like more popular, especially around performance and like performance-oriented people. It's a lot more modular too, I'd say. But Apache feels like home.
Yeah, I get that.
I can't deny though. Like if I wanted to set something up that's a bit more complicated, or there's something that I want more flexibility, rather, I would probably use Nginx. Apache would be my go-to though.
Yeah. I like the scenario where you can have Nginx be the web server and you proxy Apache in front for just ease to use. Like I love having HT access to my availability and not having to do weird stuff.
The first time I saw that, I didn't know what was happening. The whole use Nginx as a reverse proxy. Yeah. I was so confused.
Like, why is it here? It's a concept you need to wrap your head around.
Right.
So let me ask you another question, because we've done quite a bit of a deep dive into caching layers and various ways of doing certain versions of caching at specific layers and what layers to avoid for others. When you have figured out what your feedback to the client is based on the results of your testing and your knowledge of what his or her site is doing, what is your next step in terms of implementation? How do you start such a thing?
So I've identified whatever bottleneck there is. I would try a solution. Like, let's say, it's the most common thing that I encounter, especially at Presidium, is an e-commerce store or an LMS store. Doing LMS site.
Yep.
That they work. Exactly. I guess they're both stores. Anyway, trivial. They encounter issues with logged in users. Like we have a performance audit service going on now, and the one that I'm currently working on is an LMS store. There it goes again. Is an LMS site, and his issue is logged in users, which makes sense. It's obvious. I'm actually waiting on. So you mentioned Till before. I'm waiting until we have a call with Till later tonight, maybe in the evening, so I can get my hands on the pro version of the object cache. Because I don't think we gave enough credit to the plugin before, because there are lots of solutions that talk to Redis, object cache plugins, but he built from scratch and kind of addressed issues that exist and will continue existing because they get inherited from version to version in other solutions. And that's my next step for this particular client, like applying the object cache, configuring it, and seeing if we can do something about the login user lag. Yeah. Then there's little things too, right? So the logged in users might not just, it's uncached requests may mean like an image too. Stuff like that should be offloaded. There's no reason to serve images from your actual website. If you're not using some sort of edge side caching in general with like really complicated rules that might work for logged in users, might work.
Yeah.
Then, okay, you need to offload it. Offloading means use a CDN. I know you're not a huge fan of CDNs anymore, because I know edge-side caching solves lots of things. I know. I see your videos.
Yeah. So there's... you're calling me out, huh?
It makes sense, though.
A CDN has an advantage to a point. If that CDN is in most scenarios, it's an extra layer with an extra level of latency in some way. Mm-hmm. And this is why my preference has slightly to very firmly moved into the Cloudflare ecosphere, for the simple reason that we nowadays have R2 available inside Cloudflare, which makes it fully configurable on the CDN layer that is Cloudflare. And it just makes, for me, from my perspective of not wanting to introduce all these extra different type of, let's call it latencies in the broader sense of the word, it just makes a lot of sense to just say, move it over to Cloudflare R2, which for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically Cloudflare's equivalent of Amazon S3 bucket hosting. I'm not a big fan of Amazon just for the complexity of how stuff is configured and all that. But Cloudflare is for me a logical layer. It's also a layer that there's no egress, meaning the actual cost of storing the images is really low, and you literally only pay for what is actually being used in transfer.
That's a huge point.
And that's I do some calculations. I have a few clients that are moving over to S3 and just saving a few $100 a month. That's big for essentially the same service and as I just argued, a tighter integration into using Cloudflare anyway.
Moving into R2, leaving from S3, right?
Leaving from S3 into R2,
yes.
and apparently it's happening so often that Cloudflare has an S3 import function. So you can just...
I didn't know that.
You can make your life...
Because, with all the cloud providers that say you get charged by, I don't know, the usage per second, you can't calculate that. No one can calculate that.
No.
That's
no, I like CDNs, but I like them to be... I have a strong preference to have the CDN behave in a as modern fashion as possible. And in my opinion, that is certainly how Cloudflare does things.
That makes sense. I never considered Cloudflare as a CDN provider because they're just a caching engine. A caching engine with points of presence everywhere.
Yeah. Everywhere. Yeah. I think in the last year they added like 100, 150, or the year and a half, 2 years, whatever. But there's in total, I think, 350, close to 400 data centers across the globe. That is insane. That's an insane number. And if you are right in the sense that it's just a layer. But if you were to add all your statics to Cloudflare, which it does automatically as soon as you put that layer in front of it, and then add just a few rules where certain files, images, PDFs, JavaScripts, any other type of assets. You can just say cache long. This is a good example where in certain cases you can say it's fine if you store this image for a year. That's never going to change. It may not be called inside that post anymore, but the image itself is never going to change. So it's fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially, okay, so let's say you've done that. Another really important step is documenting that you've done something like that. So if, knock on wood, anything ever happens to Remkus, the next guy doesn't have to figure out why he's hitting a refresh and the image isn't changing.
Yeah.
Documentation is really important. But yeah, you could fix that. You could probably cache Ajax requests too, if you're sure enough about it. There's definitely cacheable Ajax requests. You could maybe do the same thing with the query strings. Cookie caching,
yeah.
Oh, man. Could be messy as hell. But
I wouldn't recommend it. But there's scenarios where it makes sense. But yeah, that is my. I think I'm slowly moving into that as my default way to solve CDNs.
And then there's the issue. I recently had a conversation in the form of a podcast with Elena from Woo Ninjas, and that had to do with WooCommerce at a scale. What do you do when you scale with WooCommerce? And one of her questions was a very hard one: personalized caching. So caching for logged in users. What do you do there? Usually nothing. Just out of the box, usually nothing.
Yeah.
But if you've got really good collaboration with your developer, or if the provider with the actual systems has really good collaboration with the developer, and there's a certain way that all the sites from that developer or agency are built, then you can single out individual parts of the HTML. You could say everything from this tag to this tag start to this tag end is always going to be the same. Maybe exactly. In Varnish, we call it edge side includes. Like cache excludes, people exclude things like anything that generates some sort of one-time code. What are those called? The nuances? Nonce?
Yeah.
Yes. Anything that generates that really hard to say word, we want to not include in the cache. So those are excludes. Excludes are all over the place. Everyone's kind of familiar with excluding things, but including things is a bit different. So let's say you had a static banner on your website for logged in users. You can cache that, but you need really good collaboration between the person developing the site and the either provider if you're using something like Varnish, or maybe if you're doing it yourself on Cloudflare and you're both a developer. Okay, fine.
Yeah, and I think there's an extra option available. There is Andrei Savchenko, Rarst, on the socials. He has a plugin called Fragment Caching. It's on GitHub, and it's a good base to use for these types of scenarios where you can basically you essentially have a mechanism to determine your fragment caching inside of WordPress. It's quite cool.
I'm gonna look that up. What was his name?
Andrei Savchenko. I think he just online basically is known as Rarst, RARST.net.
That's cool. I'm happy I learned something and I have something to look into after this call.
Ah, cool.
But yeah, that's fragment caching.
Yeah,
which isn't really big. I don't think it should be big either. There's way too much room for error. Way too much. Unless everything was standardized.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you have a standardized environment and you're pretty sure that you can determine which sections you can safely fragmentally cache, then please do. Otherwise, just stay the hell away from it, because it's just you're opening a can of worms in things that are just going to mess up.
And in the case of WordPress,
I like how
e-commerce, you're losing sales.
Yo, it will ruin your sales. Yeah. I was going to say, I like how we got from you describing what you do for your work to basically progressing into explaining every single caching layer available to us. In that they all hook into determining what is the scalability of your site, because most people think I just throw more hardware. Or
definitely. I mean, okay. Your example for what do I do after I identify bottlenecks? The particular situation that I described for the client that I'm currently running a performance audit for now, it has to do with logged in requests. It could not have been. It's usually almost always logged in requests. If it's not logged in requests, I would think something's wrong with the actual site.
And oftentimes it is.
Yeah. Because caching like static content or caching non-logged in stuff, it's pretty straightforward. A plugin can't really screw that up hard. A certain custom site configuration or maybe custom Ajax request that like runs after you scroll something so it could bring something back. Yeah, that could sit there and load forever. Fine. Especially if something's going out, like you get a 503 that you never see, like a server error, and you can't see the 503. JavaScript's not going to be like, sorry, 503.
Sorry. Yeah.
You have to actually go into logs.
Yeah, it's going to go, let me try that again.
Over and over and over. That's where the front end stuff, like the core web vitals, come into play.
Yeah.
No,
I was going to say this is where what people see as the layer for anybody understanding all the steps that we have outlined. This is actually the final layer. So the optimization of the output of your front end HTML/CSS/JavaScript, that is the last part. That is the part where you go, okay, I've done my smartest queries. I've done my smartest bootstrapping, my loading, the way all of the things I'm doing. I have got everything optimized in all the different various caching layers, and yet I'm still running into issues. And no, I'm saying that wrong. You're not running into issues, but you're running into, okay, and now there's one layer left to do, and that is indeed front-end optimization, which is what I like WP Rocket, the example that we talked about. I use that plugin for that mostly, not for actually generating HTML. I usually turn that off and solve that differently.
Okay, that's acceptable too. I would, okay, I'm good with that. Like that sits well with me too. So you brought up using a plugin for very specific tasks. You and every other performance engineer out there have probably said the site is slow because it's got a million plugins. Well, it's not necessarily the million plugins. It's that each plugin does a million things too, right? And you don't need that. It could be a million plugins that do one thing, but it's usually not. It's great to use a plugin like you described now. Like, I'm going to use this plugin for that particular feature, and for that to be available, and for that plugin to have been, this is a rant now, and for that plugin to have been made in a sense where when you use a certain feature, that feature is enabled. Not everything is enabled by default.
Correct.
These things don't really
Rocket has a filter for this, so you can turn it off. There's a setting inside it as well, but you want to solve this at code level as soon as it loads. And if the hosting environment has a proper solution of integrating whatever's being generated as HTML, but then on the hosting layer, and you get to sync that to Cloudflare, that is my preferred solution. Just makes it super easy. I'm not relying on plugins too much, because you're right. The amount of plugins, and let us be very clear about that. The amount of plugins on your WordPress site is not the problem. It's what they do.
No, not necessarily. Exactly.
I got clients who got close to 100 plugins or more, some of them, and they still load fine. Everything within sometimes even half a second. It's not the number of plugins.
Let's be clear too. A plugin could be a plugin at the end of the day for someone that hasn't ever developed a plugin could just be 4 lines of code in a file that starts in a certain fashion and that gets recognized as a plugin. Yeah, that doesn't necessarily have to be something huge. Like an SEO plugin is something huge. Yoast is something huge. It does a lot of work.
Yeah,
it could just be one little thing that you don't want to include in something called the little snippets.
Yeah, and those are plugins as well. The whole performance optimization discord that we've seen in the last couple of years, it's finally changing a little bit, but the vast majority of people still think, add a cachings plugin, we're done. Doing some front-end optimization, that's it, we're done, and just keep the number of plugins real low, and we're done. And that's just not the case. I'm glad to hear that you agree, because this is a signal we need to talk about.
But you have to accept though, so at Presidium, the support team, the DevOps support team, more often than not, when they do see a site with a large number of plugins, in reality, it's because of the large number of plugins, because of what those plugins do. Fine. Absolutely. I will put that asterisk there. But it is a first indicator. Like when you do a list with like the WP-CLI command for like the plugins, the number, and when you see 100, the first thing I'm going to think is like, okay, he's got plugins doing the same thing redundantly over and over. Things are activated that don't need to be activated. And our job sometimes is really boring. So you mentioned the bottlenecks, how maybe I would identify one. One way is literally running the test, or running like a flat, long test, an endurance test, and just going in and pushing activate, deactivate.
Yeah.
Sometimes that really helps. It really works. It's kind of boring. In time, with experience, you kind of have a feeling as to what plugin might be causing issues. Yeah. But it does help. We jumped around again. We were at the front end stuff. So all the stuff we talked about before was back end stuff. And then there's like the front end optimization that has to do with Core Web Vitals. Not necessarily, but Core Web Vitals do help you identify things and communicate them with other people. They're just metrics. Yeah. Everything's just measuring something. Sabrina, our colleague, actually performance engineer, Sabrina shared her process for how she does front-end optimization. I think it was at WordCamp Porto. I think she had a talk. Not sure which WordCamp it was.
I don't think I've seen it, but I've seen her. Obviously, I know her. But I also know that she explained different sets of what she does at Nathan Wrigley's podcast.
Oh, I haven't seen that. So we both have homework.
We both do. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of steps that you need to take. It's not just turning on the plugin. You need to understand what it says, what the feedback is given, all of those things.
Yeah, some things are kind of overlooked too. Like, how often do you really find websites using image formats that are WebP or AVIF? Never. Come on.
The clients
Rarely.
coming to me? Rarely. How many leaving with that format? A lot.
Yeah, definitely. Plugins are starting to help there too, with like automatically generating the WebP version and giving you the option to use the PNG on browsers that don't support WebP. But even that's really trivial. Which browser that most people have that has a large market share, and what version has a large market share of what browser doesn't support WebP or AVIF?
Yeah, I think AVIF is probably the question mark, but the rest most certainly are using WebP.
WebP, for sure.
Oh.
Yep, those are small things we can do on the front end side. So the first thing I would always look at is images. LCP, largest contentful paint, the biggest thing on your page, the first largest thing on your page that shows up above the fold, so on the visible part of the screen. It's not always going to be an image. Actually, it could be text. It could be some loader. It could be, what are those things? Carousel. It could be some carousel, some JavaScript. I guess it is an image in that case.
If you're listening, please don't do that. Don't do sliders. Don't do carousels.
Yeah.
They're just
that's gross.
Nobody clicks on them. Nobody waits for them, and they're making your site slower. So don't.
Yeah, you could do it like maybe when you scroll down, you can have one of those sliders, like with the multiple images that kind of either auto rotate or you have to push like left and right. People do that with their partners, for instance. That's fine.
Yeah, and then that kind of makes sense. But the large, big header image on top that then slides into a gallery and all those things, just stop people. You're not helping anybody. Certainly not your visitors.
What about video? When you load a page and the whole background is a video.
Now, there is a smart way of doing that. So the impact is you can reduce the impact of that to close to nothing, other than it's still loading in quite a lot of MBs just to show something changing / video.
You need to show them something.
Yeah.
So you could have the video in the background, but you need to show, what's that called? I don't remember.
Not sure what you're referring to.
I don't remember what it's called. YouTube does it. Like you could, no, not lazy loading, but when you have like the image, you have YouTube. You have YouTube, what's it called, embed, and then rather than the video starting automatically, you have the image thumbnail. Right.
Just show the thumbnail. Upon clicking on the thumbnail, it actually then starts to load instead of just loading by default. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of fun stuff that, how much of your work is around this? How much do you need to look at the front end, making the site smarter?
In my daily life at Presidium, it's mostly front end stuff because most of the back end stuff is already, there, it's fixed. Because if it wasn't, then the hosting provider would have an issue, right? And our DevOps support team does cover most of those issues. And if they don't, okay, I can get involved, but they don't need me. And our SRE team definitely doesn't need me either, but our customers do. And most of the issues our customers have are with the way they set up their website. So most of the issues I do encounter, which is a really weird use case, right? So if I was doing freelancing, it would be the other way around for sure. If I was logging into some server that someone set up somewhere, it would definitely be install PHP FPM, use PHP FTM, put some sort of caching mechanism on there, maybe just Apache CGI. It would definitely be more backend oriented, and the impact would be huge from the backend stuff. But in my particular case, working at Presidium, where we do want to focus on reliability and performance and security, everyone says security, everyone focuses on it, super standardized. I don't see why people are so proud of themselves for high security. It's super standardized and it's everywhere. You have to screw something up not to provide something secure these days.
USP. It's not a unique selling point.
Exactly. It's boring. No one wants to hear about it. Everyone cares about it, but people have to realize that it's there. It's usually there by default, and you have to break it.
Yeah.
whereas reliability and performance are not there.
Those are way more unique than you actually think.
Yeah,
But
especially
security is
reliability.
not.
Like true reliability too. Like, okay, so small rant. I don't like providers that say they provide high availability arrays of like systems in the backend when they use something like AWS's RDS.
Yeah.
The relationship database service, which means that it is highly available because Amazon says it is, and because Amazon made it to be that way. Okay, you're just like reselling someone else's service, and you're just accepting the fact that they tell you that it's highly available. And fine. Same goes for using a cloud service like GCP with their database solution. I don't remember what it was called. What acronym did they have for that? It's some acronym. I don't know. I don't like this. I don't, because I would rather prefer you do it yourself. Like, put actual VMs up there, put actual servers, put them side by side, add more, remove some, make it all custom for your, particular client, especially if it's a resource heavy website. It's so much more respectable. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a big fan of cloud hosting as a concept. Having your own cloud, yes. Relying on an external cloud, I think we could dedicate a whole podcast on just that concept of all the things that are going wrong with that.
Yeah, I mean, how do you troubleshoot? Like, if you don't know how it works, how do you troubleshoot?
Yeah.
By opening a support ticket to your cloud provider on behalf of your client. Boing. Yeah. It's terrible.
Yeah, that's a horrible one.
But yeah, my day-to-day business, as far as performance audits do go, we have some performance audit service up now at Presidium. It has to do with front-end stuff, primarily. Because that's where our customers have more issues. And it's almost always something related to, like, LCP is always bad.
Yeah.
It's the first thing that it shouldn't be the first thing that I tackle, because there's a series of things you should do first, like, I don't know, FCP, first contentful paint. But usually at the end of the day, when I bring first contentful paint or largest contentful paint towards first contentful paint, everything is good. Yeah. As long as there's not a big gap.
The large is called the large for a reason.
No.
Because it has a large.
You can bring those guys together, and your site's like
poof. I love them. I love them when they're like that. All right.
I never really have the flexibility to say, oh, you want to close up? Anyway, a small point. I never really have the flexibility to say what most of our performance engineers or most of our performance-oriented people want to say. Delete it, remove it, get rid of it. Yeah. Like, if it's a huge image, just get rid of it.
I will actually say that a lot of times when dealing with the front-end optimization things to do, that is what I will say, because it just doesn't make sense. You want it there because it's shiny, but it doesn't bring you any value. It's holding you back. It's causing all kinds of issues that are in some level are just anywhere between annoying and just hurting you.
No one cares.
Nobody cares. Just delete it.
No one cares.
Bring it back to what it needs to be. Make it fancy if you need to, but that's it. Yeah.
Exactly.
And yeah, I was going to wrap up the conversation because we've been well over an hour.
Time flies.
Yeah, time flies indeed. I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation where we really did a deep dive into caching optimization and smart things to consider as you're building just wanting to have a performant website. I think people listening have the opportunity to learn a lot. So thank you for that.
Thank you for the engaging conversation and for the opportunity too.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much.